We got a new ruling by the United States Supreme Court in the TikTok case. They are going to support, and they are not going to block, the law that now requires by Sunday that TikTok's Chinese government, communist government controlled parent company sell TikTok to a non-foreign adversary of the United States. Can't sell it to Iran, can't sell it to Russia. Got to sell it to somebody who's independent and isn't going to try to control it for its own purposes to undermine national security. There is no doubt that for more than 170 million Americans, TikTok offers a distinctive and expansive outlet for expression, means of engagement, and source of community. But Congress is determined that divestiture is necessary to address its well-supported national security concerns regarding TikTok's data collection practices and relationship with a foreign adversary. Read that as China. For the foregoing reasons, we conclude, we, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, that the challenge provisions do not violate petitioners' First Amendment rights. If the judgment of the lower court is affirmed, it is so ordered. The Supreme Court said this corporate divestiture statute requiring the forced sale of the assets is not a direct hit on First Amendment expression, and so we're not going to apply strict scrutiny. Once they decided not to apply strict scrutiny, it was going to be a lot easier for the government to justify why they were doing this. The Supreme Court adopted and agreed with Congress that TikTok represents a foreign adversary-controlled application in communications of the United States. Once they found it to be a foreign adversary-controlled application, the next step was it can be banned because it is a threat to our national security. Right? It's not just about the videos. It's about the platform ownership and data collection, not what you're making, what they're doing with your information. Right? That is the issue. And so once they found it to be a foreign adversary-controlled app, TikTok was dead in the water.
This is Democracy Watch. Mark, I want to draw your attention to a headline that even before Trump's taken office has already presented itself as especially chilling. Incoming senior Trump administration officials have begun questioning career civil servants who work on the White House National Security Council about who they voted for in the 2024 election, their political contributions, and whether they have made social media posts that could be considered incriminating by President-elect Donald Trump's team. So right off the bat, what do you make of this line of questioning, this interrogation that's happening for folks who are otherwise career civil servants?
It's completely inappropriate. It is outrageous, and it really needs to be focused on a lot more than it is. Because if it's happening in the national security arena, just imagine what's going to happen when you get into the rest of the federal government, right? So what they want is to make sure that these people are sycophants for Donald Trump. They want to make sure that these people are loyal to Donald Trump, and that is what would be incriminating.
Hi, everyone. Harry here to talk about a settlement in the long-running marathon defamation case brought by the 2 Georgia election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, whom Rudy Giuliani defamed back in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Point 1, a settlement's been reached. Point 2, we don't know the actual elements of the settlement. They came into court before Judge Lyman, who recently held Giuliani in contempt, and said a settlement has been reached. So the details maybe are to come. Point 3, it's clear that a big part of the settlement before we get to the terms has to do with some kind of, agreement not to defame. Of course, Giuliani has been under court order and held in contempt for violation of that court order, not to defame them further. And that contempt proceeding, that's the second one that actually has been in D.C. This is before Judge Lyman. But the settlement purports to be of the whole action. It certainly includes no defamation. I think it likely includes some kind of hedged apology type language that maybe the parties either really forces Giuliani to suck it up and say I was wrong and I'm sorry, or perhaps is a little bit more of a middle ground so the parties can argue about it. But in the public statement accompanying the settlement, you had Moss and Freeman saying it's a major milestone in our agreement, and they seem satisfied. Giuliani says in the statement, no one deserves to be subjected to threats, harassment, or intimidation. I and the plaintiffs have agreed not to talk about each other in any defamatory manner, and I urge others to do the same. So, right, that's a little bit hedged. It sounds as if, both of them are agreeing not to defame the other. And yes, he doesn't say I defame them and I'm sorry. He says no one deserves to be subjected to threats, harassment, or intimidation. That's the kind of thing that lawyers argue for hours and hours and hours into the wee hours. And that would be a material part of the settlement.
All right, I want to break down something incredibly important today. There's one word that's been skyrocketing in the Google search engine over the past week as Americans across the country try to wrap their heads around its meaning. And I'd like to really do a deep dive on it today. So just to lay the groundwork, we all know that Elon Musk is expected to use Office Space in the White House complex once Trump takes office in a few days. And this isn't because he was elected by anybody. It's because he bought his way in. He spent $200 million of his own wealth on Trump's campaign. He rented a headquarters in Pennsylvania so he could go knock doors himself. He also held a giveaway, $1 million giveaway for people who voted in red counties. And this was all after he basically blew $44 billion on Twitter as it hemorrhaged money. I guess he didn't blow the money because look where it got him, into the White House. Now, that also connects with the corporations and billionaires who are bankrolling Trump's inauguration. Some of the richest people in the country have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Donald Trump's presidential inaugural committee. Just listen to this for 1 second. Obama's inauguration in 2009 was worth $53 million. Trump's inauguration is going to be 4 times that amount because people like Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, people like OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, or Mark Zuckerberg, or the Uber CEO, or Ken Griffin, who's a hedge fund manager, Elon Musk, they are all donating a massive amount of money to Trump's inauguration fund. And you can probably see where I'm going with this, but I do want to say that rich people meddling with politics has been a thing since the inception of America. It's not always inherently bad. People like George Soros have used their money for good, but in this scenario, it's getting quite scary. For example, Bezos, the world's second richest man, said, quote, "Trump seems to have a lot of energy around reducing regulation. And if I can help him do that, I'm going to help him," Bezos said. "We do have too much regulation in this country," says the world's second richest man. Their message is clear. When Trump takes a presidential oath of office on January 20th, his job is to work for them. This dude ran a campaign as a populist who's going to help the American people, yet he has all of these rich people at his inauguration with $1 million tables, and that's why this article was brought to my attention. Searches for what is an oligarchy spike after Biden's warning. Biden gave his farewell address about 2 days back, and he just straight up said it. We are turning into an oligarchy. I'll play the clip in 1 second, but after that, we saw a massive spike in the Google search trends. So this website right here is named Google Trends. It's run by Google, and you can see how people search things, what rate they searched at. What is an oligarchy is what I have typed in right here. And the interest over time spikes from about 1 or 0 to 100 after Biden gave his farewell address. You can even see the dark blue states are states where there were extra searches, and we're seeing a lot of searches in red states. So in Indiana, you see 89 out of 100. Alabama, 91 out of 100. Georgia, 86 compared to the interest before.
Candidates are increasingly dependent on the very, very wealthy. And I'm proud, by the way, that the vast majority of our money comes from working people. But if I'm a normal politician who needs to raise $20, $50 million, where do I go? I'm going to sit down with the wealthy. I'm going to go to the country club. I'm going to do my fundraisers at fancy resorts. And I get to know those people. But that's the whole point of this corrupt campaign finance system. If you're going to contribute $1 million to my super PAC, well, maybe you're a hell of a nice guy and you like to participate. Or maybe you want something. I think you want something. And you and I are going to become really good buddies so I can do your bidding. In other words, the millionaire class and the billionaire class increasingly own the political process and they own the politicians who go to them for money. And I worry very much, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, that we are moving very, very quickly from a democratic society, one person, one vote, to an oligarchic form of society where billionaires will be determining who the elected officials of this country are. I'm going to do everything I can to stop that.
When you say you want to see elections be publicly funded, do you want to cut the ability to privately fund them?
The first thing that I want to do is overturn the Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision, which is a total disaster. Free speech does not equal the ability of people to buy elections. And what I have said is, if elected President of the United States, any Supreme Court nominee I make will make it very clear that he or she is going to vote to overturn Citizens United. Second of all, I think what you want to do is at least make sure that candidates who are running will have as much money as their opponents who may have unlimited sums of money. Thirdly, I think there are various ways that you can approach the issue. One way, which I find intriguing, is that you either give a tax credit or basically provide $100 for every citizen in the United States of America. And you say to that person, here's your $100. You can make a contribution, you get a $100 tax credit if you spend that $100 on any candidate you want. I think that would democratize very significantly the political process in America and take us a long way away from these super PACs controlled by billionaires who are now buying elections.
So there's no point in blaming the reflection in the mirror. Putin offered the oligarchs a deal. Bend to my authority.
It's great to welcome Thom Hartmann back to the program. Of course, host of the Thom Hartmann program and author of the Hidden History series. His latest book is The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Always great to have you on, Tom.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here with you.
So let's go back a little bit, as you always do in the books, and talk about the origins of some of these issues that still plague the country today. How far back does this sort of oligarchical apparatus exist in the history of the United States?
It's just admitting.
Well,
that
it goes back
we're
to
never going to have an election before Trump takes
arguably,
office, that means, in a way,
Plymouth
you
Rock
are
and
obeying
slightly
in advance,
before.
and you're just giving up. You're being that cynical.
But
We need to keep
yeah,
fighting.
because we
We're
fought
not Russia.
a
And I know people
war,
in
the
the comments are gonna be like,
Revolutionary
Adam,
War
we
against the
basically are
oligarchy
Russia.
of
We're
the
not-
United
we're
Kingdom.
not
It
Russia
was
yet.
called a
Trust me.
monarchy, but it's
Quote,
just
"These
another
individuals
version of
have measured
oligarchy.
themselves at the expense of the Russian
Oligarchy
people," the
being
White House
defined
said recently,
broadly as
announcing
rule by the
sanctions against
rich,
over a dozen
the
oligarchs,
consolidation of
including,
political
quote,
power
"They
into
say
a
the top
small
Russia's
number of very
largest
wealthy
companies are
hands.
responsible for
It's sort of the
providing
political
resources
version
necessary
of
to
what
support
monopoly
Putin's
is in the
invasion of
economic
Ukraine.
marketplace.
So in Russia's case, we can
And
safely
then
say
we've
oligarchs are a
had
small group of
we're now
unelected
in the midst of our
individuals who have
third
concentrated their
real
power by
internal
wielding their
challenge by
disproportionate
oligarchs
amount of
in the
wealth.
era
And they
from the
use their wealth
1830s
to
to the
entrench their power within
1860s,
politics
largely
outside
as
the
a result of the
formal
invention of
election
the cotton
systems.
gin.
Can I just go back to
The
this article?
South
Elon Musk is expected to use
consolidated
office
massively.
space in the
Small
White House
farmers,
complex
particularly
the
cotton
richest
farmers,
man in the
were
room
wiped
to get
out.
his way
Large
into the White House, and now
plantations
he uses
and their
office
owners
space.
rose up and
Not
took
because he
over
was
the
elected.
entire
He
political
wasn't even
structure of
born
the
in America.
South.
He was not elected by
Declared war on the
anybody.
North.
The
Didn't
location.
like that pesky democracy next door that was, agitating and rabble-rousing among their ranks. And we fought a bloody war against these oligarchs and defeated them, and in fact broke up their plantations. Parchment is now a state prison in Louisiana. Robert E. Lee's plantation, one of the largest, is now Arlington National Cemetery, et cetera. So and then they rose up again in the 1880s, 1890s with the Industrial Revolution, a new generation of oligarchs, and to the point that in the 1930s, in 1933. They tried to hire Smedley Butler to kidnap or assassinate Franklin Roosevelt. They already had enlisted over 100,000 right-wing veterans out of this right-wing veterans group to march on the White House and seize him. We overthrew that, and Roosevelt openly said, they hate me and I welcome their hatred. He put the oligarchs back in the bottle, and they stayed there until the 1980s. Reagan let them back out again, along with a little help from the Supreme Court. And today, we're now facing the third major confrontation between oligarchy and democracy. And this study from Gillens and Page suggests that we are now in a full-blown oligarchy. And the question facing America today is, do we continue going down that road, or do we go back to democracy? Because oligarchies are very unstable, and oligarchies tend to resolve themselves in one of two ways. Either the oligarchs are defeated, as we did in the 1860s and as we did in the 1930s, or the oligarchs turn a nation into a police state, as Viktor Orban has done in Hungary or Putin in Russia, in order to maintain their power. Those are the choices we're facing right now.
When it comes to sometimes what you might call the conventional wisdom around oligarchy, which is often not, it might be conventional, but it's not necessarily accurate. There's this idea that the biggest acceleration in this oligarchical overclass, so to speak, was during industrialization, in part because of the ability to really concentrate wealth among those who could own a lot of those factories and take advantage of the industrialization that was taking place. Is it accurate to point that as the biggest moment of acceleration of this, or would that not be right?
Well, technological changes always have massive societal impacts. I mean, you can find that all the way back to the agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the invention of steel, et cetera. And typically those kinds of changes, as society gets reordered, you have a class within society that succeeds in grabbing as much of the pie as they can. The technological innovation in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, was the invention by Eli Whitney of the cotton gin. The hardest part of the bottleneck in the production of cotton is getting those seeds out of a bowl of cotton. They're really hard to pull out. And the cotton gin could do what 50 enslaved people could do in the same amount of time. So the big plantations, which could afford the cotton gins, were able, they're 50 times more efficient. And that's how they wiped out their small competitors. Similarly, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you saw people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and the DuPont family or Mr. DuPont, I forget his first name, Alfred DuPont, I think. No, it was Alfred. In any case, you saw these guys doing essentially the same thing, monopolizing, the wealth and then converting that economic power into political power. And that's what we've seen the billionaire class do now in the last 40 years in the United States.
How do you apply this analysis to what we've seen over the last year during this pandemic, where we've seen, when it comes to business, we've seen very large businesses that already had certain degrees of infrastructure in place sweep up even more market share, as a lot of small businesses, mom and pops and others, for a variety of different reasons, have gone under, likely permanently in the cases of many of them?
Well, we're witnessing another reconsolidation, this time in part because of the pandemic, but also in large part because in 1983, Ronald Reagan stopped enforcing the antitrust laws in this country, and we haven't had a president since then that did enforce them. So, if the NFL said, we're just not going to enforce laws against people punching each other in the gut as they run by or ripping face masks off, pretty soon, eventually, you're going to have, the team that's the best at punching people and ripping face masks off is going to be the team that's winning all the games in the NFL. That's what's happened here. I mean, it might take a while before you get there because everybody, considers it kind of distasteful. But when Reagan changed the rules of business, he really set us up on this trajectory to where we're at right now.
You mentioned the two ways that oligarchy can go. It can be defeated or it can become the police states that you described, Orban, Putin, etc. What tends to determine whether it goes one way or the other?
The people. Whether typically what precipitates the crisis that flips oligarchy in one direction or the other is usually an economic crisis. And that's what Russia's facing right now with the very, very low oil prices, which is what their economy is, based on. With Orban, it was the Syrian refugees flooding into Hungary, and it produced both an economic and a social/political crisis. And the first thing that Orban did when he moved from being a president to being an autocrat was to say that he was going to build a wall along the southern border of Hungary to keep out the Syrian refugees. He actually built that wall, by the way. And it's amazing. There's a whole chapter in my book about this, how Trump basically was following Orban's playbook blow by blow by blow. I mean, it was just breathtaking. And so, it's a crisis usually that precipitates that.
What is it that distinguishes an oligarch from simply a billionaire or a multi-millionaire? Is it a political power component? Is it something about the political system in which they operate?
Generally speaking, I mean, the definition is subject to popular whim. There are dictionary definitions for an oligarch, typically described as a very wealthy person. But I think in this context, and certainly in the modern context, when we talk about oligarchs, whether we're talking about Russian oligarchs or American oligarchs or whatever, we're talking about people who have amassed great wealth and are using that for not only increasing their own wealth, but seizing the political power and process in a way that will increase their own wealth and guarantee the continuation of their wealth and their political power.
Some might argue that the successes against the oligarchy that we saw during the New Deal era, FDR, you mentioned that earlier in your sort of kind of brief history of the trajectory of this in the United States. Some might argue that a combination of an additional many decades of entrenchment of power among the few in the United States, combined with the media apparatus that's fomented by high-speed internet and the sort of fragmentation of media, make this a very different situation from that in which the successes during FDR and the New Deal era took place. And so it really needs to be a different roadmap for achieving maybe a similar outcome. Do you agree with that circumstances have changed to such a degree that the playbook must be different to some degree or not at all or completely?
What FDR did was he repudiated the economic policies of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. Those policies were almost identical to the ones that Ronald Reagan put into place that we're confronting right now. When Herbert Hoover ran for president, his two big sales pitches were, number one, a return to normalcy. That was his slogan. What he meant by that was dropping that top tax rate of 91% that Woodrow Wilson had put in during World War I back down to 25%, which he did. And his second one was more business and government, less government and business. In other words, privatize and deregulate, which was Reagan's agenda, which he did. And that took us to the Great Depression. The generation before that, in the 1890s, the supply-siders, so-called, had this theory called the horse and sparrow theory, which was that because back then people, didn't have cars, they rode horses, and the streets in every town in America were filled with piles of horse manure, and sparrows love to pick, the occasional bit of undigested grain out of them. And so the theory was, if you feed the horses more oats, more undigested oats will come out the back end, which will feed the sparrows. In other words, give the rich people their tax cuts, and that will trickle down to the average worker.
Yeah, sort of a farmhouse trickle down. Yeah,
recycled now 3 times in the last 160 years.
What should the playbook be for the people at this point in time?
Well, what FDR did is he went back to classic economics, Adam Smith economics, and in that, he said that basically what drives an economy is demand, not supply. And demand is aggregate demand is the phrase economists use. It's a fancy word that really just means wages. So if we want to get our economy back in order, what we need to do is get money into the hands of average people. And to a certain extent, that means going back to top tax brackets that are substantial, well over 50%, and making sure that when people do work, they're properly and appropriately remunerated, paid for that. So you've got the $15 minimum wage. We need to bring back labor unions, which pretty much nobody's talking about right now, but it really should be at the top of the agenda, and strengthen workplace protections. and worker protections right across the board. And we need to strengthen the social safety net. We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't consider healthcare a right and offer basically free healthcare to everybody. We're the only developed country in the world that has medical debt as a cause of personal bankruptcy. We're the only developed country in the world that has student debt, anything close to what we have. Every other developed country in the world offers either free or very inexpensive college to anybody who can qualify. We don't. It's insane. We need to go back to the foundation, foundational economics. This was stuff that literally Thomas Jefferson was pitching. He started the first free university in the United States, the University of Virginia, and was very proud of the fact that it was completely free. He thought that would build America. He was right.
It seems that one of the big propaganda victories that the economic right, I mean, going back to the time, maybe Reagan forward when it comes to these supply side trickle down ideas, one of the biggest propaganda victories they've had is pushing out the understanding of the demand side of economics completely. And you see it even when minimum wage is discussed. You hear the discussion of, well, that's going to increase costs for the businesses and they'll have to lay people off and they won't be able to afford employees. It ignores which to some degree ignores that labor is only one input cost for the product or service that's being produced. But it also ignores the fact that you're creating demand side stimulus and all of a sudden, all of those employees have more money that they can spend at other businesses. It has been a huge victory to completely make it a one-sided conversation, has it not?
That's right, and you're absolutely right. And it's not an accidental propaganda victory.
Right.
Lewis Powell laid this out in 1971. I documented in this book on American oligarchy, and then Nixon the next year put him on the Supreme Court, where he proceeded, in a series of decisions to cement these policies in place. And groups like the Heritage Foundation and the funding of universities around the country, university professors in economics and political science and things like that, think tanks that are publishing constantly. I mean, do any Google search on pretty much anything that is peripheral to the interests of the billionaire class, and you'll find just the first 20 links are going to be right-wing propaganda. It's really pretty breathtaking how much money they've put into this, how large an infrastructure they have built out since 1971 to promote this right-wing worldview that really only benefits the top 1% of Americans.